Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Deputy Speaker, it's very interesting to listen to the former Premier, Brad Cannonier, and his speech. And he just finished off a speech talking about how he was concerned about resignations. That should shock the island, should send shock waves through the island. Because that honorable member, Mr. Speaker, and he said he resigned. If I remember correctly, he was removed in the cloak of darkness. And we still don't know, Mr. Speaker, why.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
What's your point of order, Mr. Cannonier?
Honorable members misleading the House. Again, he's repeated this over and over, cloak of darkness, all of this kind of stuff. He knows nothing of what he talks about. He's the only MP before the courts, nobody else.
Continue, Mr. DeSilva.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that, too, is interesting that Mr. Cannonier should talk about who's before the courts. Maybe Horseshoe Beach needs to be investigated, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and who the minister was that gave Rick Olson that contract and why he gave it to him. So tell Mr. Cannonier, I'll take my seat and let him explain that.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
I hear a point of order. I can't recognize the voice.
Speculating once again.
Just 1 second, member. I'm trying to recognize who is speaking. You say a point of order, then you wait for my acknowledgement. Don't go on to say a point of order and start talking. Who's giving the point of order?
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
As Mr. Cannonier, what's your point of order, sir?
Point of order, the honorable member once again is speculating and misleading the House. An investigation was done into it. So maybe he needs to do his homework, because he usually does his homework. He's a little emotive right now.
Point of order, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Who's
Honorable member from constituency 10.
Is that Mr. Dunkley?
Yes, sir.
What's your point of order, sir?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, as the Premier at the time, I made sure that that contract was awarded in an appropriate way. So any allegations to Mr. Cannonier are false and should be retracted. The honorable member is out of line.
Thank you, Mr. Dunkley. You made your point.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I appreciate your time.
Mr. DeSilva, continue. You heard
Mr. Speaker, then since we're on apologies, let's have one from Mr. Cannonier. I have not been before the courts for anything to do with anything at all. You talk about speculation, Mr. Speaker. All I said was maybe Mr. Cannonier needs to explain to the people of this country how Mr. Rick Olson got a contract at Horseshoe Beach. That's all I said. I didn't give any sort of accusations whatsoever. But see, sometimes a guilty conscience pricks people hard, don't it? You see, so I didn't make any accusations, Mr. Speaker.
I'll apologize, Mr. Speaker. I'll apologize. He's been charged.
Mr. Cannonier, you just cannot speak out like that, okay? Let's get it straight now.
Oh, I put my video on.
If you got a point of order, state, sir. State it, I should say.
My apologies.
What's your point of order, sir?
Yeah, I said that I apologize to him. I should have said that he's the only one in the House that's been charged. MP that's been charged with something. So if he wants to go down this road, we got a long road that I can go with him, for sure.
And Mr. Speaker, that's why I said maybe some other things should be investigated too. And I'll let those who wear the hat, let it fit, and let them wear it, and let them deal with it, Mr. Speaker. As that will be dealt with in due time too, Mr. Speaker, because we understand that I'm not the only Progressive Labour Party member that has been in this type of situation before, Mr. Speaker, and I won't be the last either, I can assure you. Let's move on. Let's move on, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, for point, Mr. Deputy Speaker,
opposition.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, point of clarity.
It's very difficult to recognize the voice.
I take no point of clarification. I take no point of clarification, Mr. Speaker.
Is he saying that more PLP members will be charged?
I didn't recognize. Hang on. You asked for a point of clarification.
I don't
The member
take
said
that.
it's not taking a clarification.
Okay,
Continue, Mr. DeSilva.
he spoke the truth.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Burgess. And what the honorable member was indicating, let's just be clear. I said, I am not the first, and I won't be the last, Mr. Speaker. Witch hunts in this island are alive and well. And I just tell everyone that sits in this honorable house, especially if you wear a green and white shirt, to be prepared, because you never know when your turn is coming. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me move on. A lot of noise has been made today, and I call it noise from the opposition about the resignation of our former finance minister. I think it's rather rich, Mr. Deputy Speaker, rich, that they want to try to get political points out of his resignation. We had their former chairman, Fad Hollis, who resigned, Mr. Speaker, over the $350,000 Westgate. Now listen, Mr. Cannoneer, talk about that for a moment. He had a former chairman who investigated it, and he resigned. Why did the former chairman?
There's a point of order. So what's the point of order, Mr. Cannoneer?
Yeah, the honorable members misleading the House, again trying to assign why someone resigned. The chairman, former chairman, resigned. That was not the reason he resigned, because he found out the truth. Again.
Well, Mr. Cannoneer, I continue, Mr. DeSilva.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. You see, you can tell when you're hitting home. You can really tell, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because not only did he resign, but they had several other people resigned as well. And in fact, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm very curious as to why there's so much concern over our finance minister resigning. And it seems to be serious concern by the opposition when they had a premier, first time in our history, resign, Mr. Acting Speaker, in our history. And we still don't know. We still don't know why he resigned.
Point of order, Deputy Speaker.
Now, Mr. Cannoneer, is that taking point of orders is at the discretion of the chair. Now, what's your point of order? We're not going to be playing this all day.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honorable member is speculating once again, and that should not happen.
But Mr. Cannoneer, you opened this up. You know, you were speculating and making all sorts of statements. You opened it up.
But I'd like for the Deputy Speaker to say when I speculated, because all we have done is spoke on behalf of the people that were coming from.
Don't ask the Deputy Speaker any questions.
I would love to hear where I speculated. I never speculate. I speak the truth. I was kicked out of the house.
But you made some allegations.
The truth. I was kicked out of the house.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Cannoneer,
the honorable member's using up my time.
please. Mr. DeSilva, continue.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. See, Mr. Deputy Speaker, these guys know when I speak, I'm going to hit them. And they want to try to use up my time. So, Mr. Speaker, let me carry on. It's amazing that the honorable member Cannoneer just talked about bring back Mark Bean, bring back Paula Cox. The same people they crucified every week. It's amazing. Last week, they were crucifying the finance minister over his trouble. Crucifying him. And had he not resigned, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I contend that you would have heard, that would have been their topic. That would have been their topic of conversation this week.
I can recognize opposition. I can see you, but it's very difficult to hear you guys.
We had no trouble being heard all day, Mr. Speaker, so perhaps...
Now, Mr. Chairman, you heard what I said? I've got difficulty hearing you, so don't tell me about all day. I've got difficulty hearing you. Please get to the mic so I can hear you.
Mr. Speaker, I'm moving from where I've sat all day, and I've been heard all day, including by you.
That's disrespectful.
Mr. Chairman,
I'm just saying...
You heard what I said. I don't want to hear any more from you on that. You understand me?
I'm taking your direction, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate it. Thank you. I hope you can hear me now.
Continue.
Thank you. The honorable member is misleading the House. And I believe intentionally so. Not one member of the opposition stood up and criticized the finance minister. He's referring to a media story about the finance minister's travel. There was no comment in that story from any member of the opposition, nor did any member of the opposition speak to it in the House. So I would ask that you withdraw that remark, which is misleading. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. DeSilva, the opposition hasn't stated that in the House, and I didn't see anything attributed to them directly.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. I'll withdraw that, Deputy Speaker. But I'll tell you what, had he not resigned this week, I can guarantee you that the opposition would have had something to say about that this week, because that's how they are. But Mr. Speaker, I move on. And my next comment is with regard to the former Premier Sir John Swan. I mean, my thing is, who the hell does he think he is, Mr. Deputy Speaker? This is a former Premier.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
What's your point of order,
Mr. Speaker?
That's unparliamentary language that's just been used by the member of Parliament, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Continue, Mr. DeSilva.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, for a former Premier to say that our Premier, David Black, is mishandling this crisis, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is damaging our economy, international business, and the man that had a background in international business and banking. And to go after our Premier, Mr. Speaker, the Premier appoints ministers. If a minister resigns, even if the Premier disagrees, and that minister is determined to resign, he has to accept it. So to point for the honorable, the former Premier of this country, John Swan, to point at our Premier and try to make him look bad, in my opinion, with his comments in the paper this week, is poor. Poor, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Any Premier of a country, if a minister resigns and that's their choice, you cannot make them stay. And by the way, all of a sudden, in one day, the country's in a crisis, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I'm disappointed in the OBA for riding this horse of the Sir John Swan bandwagon, because they have jumped on it. They know damn well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the budget is going to be presented next Friday.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
It's a point of order. There's a point of order.
It's MP Chairman, Mr. Speaker. This is the second occasion of
Brother Chairman, it's still difficult to hear you. Can you come closer to the mic?
Mr. Speaker, this is now the second occasion of unparliamentary language by the Speaker, by this MP speaking.
Mr. Chairman, I've been here in this Parliament long enough and heard that language before. That language is not stated as profane language in the dictionary.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Then I'll use it in my vocabulary.
I'm not giving you permission to do anything. Mr. Dunkley, don't make those statements. Let them in the chair. Please.
Honorable member, I think this member needs to control his language. It's out of
Mr. Dunkley, did you call a point of order?
Call a point of order, and I am.
All right, Mr. Dunkley, if you don't call a point of order, I'm not recognizing you.
I did call a point of order, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
I didn't hear you. Okay, you got a point of order.
Okay.
State your case.
Okay.
MP Pearman has adequately stated it. This member is out of line with the language. He pushes the limits all the time.
Okay, Mr. Dunkley, I've ruled on that. Continue, Mr. DeSilva.
Thank you,
honorable member.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, as I was about to say, that I think it's rather bold for anyone, let alone a former Premier, to chastise our Premier for the resignation on his own, he decided, Mr. Deputy Premier, that he wanted to resign. Now, what disappoints me with the OBA is they know, well, I know they were the shortest government in our history, so maybe they didn't have too much experience. But they certainly had enough experience, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to know that when budgets are started working on in October, November the previous year, everyone knows that sits in this honorable house that they shouldn't be here. that the budgets by this time, Mr. Deputy Speaker, are all but done. So if Mr. Curtis Dickerson had got hit by a bus this week, Mr. Speaker, and unfortunately died, what would we have done? We just carry on. All the speeches has been written for every ministry. All the budgets have been decided. Life goes on. And as a businessman, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I've had some very key people in my business experience that have left me at the last minute, whether it be through their own accord or otherwise. But you know what you do, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in business and in government, as the Premier said this week? Life goes on. Nobody on this chat, nobody in this Zoom call, no one in the House of Parliament or the Senate is irreplaceable. Any one of us could die tonight, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But what I will say is this. I have a lot of respect for Curtis Dickerson too. And I believe that he's done a good job. And you know, because he's done such a good job and resigned just a couple of days ago, I have to believe that that job will continue. We will reap the benefit of his good work. All we have to do is deliver the budget in which he had a big hand in producing. So I fret not, Mr. Deputy Speaker. You got the wrong guy. You got the wrong guy. Because life goes on. And the OBA, UBP, BDA, call them what you like, they should know from experience that you're here today, going tomorrow, but life goes on. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, how much time do I have left, please?
You have 6 minutes.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, I listened very intently to MP, the Honourable Member Jackson. And another one I was disappointed in, Mr. Speaker. Another one. Because she talked, again, the boogeyman talk, Mr. Speaker. The boogeyman talk. And I quote, she said, this island will face times like we've never faced before. Now, that may be true in the context of the statement. But her context was because our finance minister resigned. And she went on to say that we are in big, and I quote, big, big trouble. And she's worried about all people suffering. Now, where was she in 2012 to 2017, Mr. Deputy Speaker? Now, I could go through a litany of programs that the OBA canceled under their government. I could also mention 3 big things that they did too. And it wasn't for the same people that she indicated were suffering. And if anybody from the opposition wants me to name those 3, I will. I'll take a 3-second break. But I didn't think so, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, let me say this. What I didn't appreciate about the member Susan Jackson is she went after my colleague, Van Keynes. She went after him, Mr. Speaker, but all I'm going to say is this. Because she is so perfect, and their party is so perfect, and they never made any mistakes, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But I'll tell you what, we in the Progressive Labour Party, we're like our everyday people that vote for us, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We make mistakes. We do. And we admit to our mistakes, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but I'll tell you what, when we make mistakes, we tie up our laces, we tie those shoes nice and tight, and we get back to work. And MP Keynes is one of those people. So I took exception to the honourable member going after him in particular. Because everybody, Mr. Speaker, makes mistakes on our side, but they are so perfect over there in the OBA. They don't make mistakes. But you know what, Mr. Deputy Speaker? We in the Progressive Labour Party, we'll make some mistakes, and we'll make some more. But you know what, Mr. Deputy Speaker?
Hang on, Mr. DeSilva. I hear somebody, I don't know if it's said, but I hear somebody.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I just want to make a point of order that he's making a personal attack.
He?
the member of constituency 29 is making personal attacks.
No, I'm not, Mr. Speaker, to make any personal attack.
Hang on, Mr. DeSilva. Continue, Ms. Jackson.
I'm not perfect,
Are you finished?
and I refuse to accept any of the accusations that he's making against me.
Okay, continue, Mr. DeSilva.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I didn't make any accusations against that honorable member. All I said was that she's perfect. That's all I said. I didn't make not one accusation. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, let me finish on this note, right? We've watched the press go after our premier in the last week. And even some opposition members mentioned again tonight about rest, right? And what you have to realize is, I want to tell the people of this country something. Even Mr. Cannoneer said again tonight, I'm before the courts. And let me tell you what happens when you go before the courts, Mr. Speaker. The banks cut you off financially. I know from experience. So Cannoneer and the rest, stop it. You're going after our premier now. Stop it. Because if by chance he dropped a piece of paper on the ground and the police happen to see it and want to book him or charge him until he gets in court and prove his innocence, guess what? The banks will cut you off. And it's not right. And we in this honorable house, Mr. Deputy Speaker, have to stop it. We have to stop it because that is serious, Mr. Speaker. And now the combined opposition,
Point of order.
combined opposition are going after our premier.
One second, Mr. DeSilva. Mr. Cannoneer, what's your point of order?
Yeah, unfortunately, the honorable member is misleading the House. It sounds as if he's trying to say that only PLP members have been under that. I can speak to that myself. That I have been under that.
Before the courts, Mr. Cannoneer?
No, not before the courts. Not before the courts. Not before the courts. Never been before the courts, Mr.
But that's what
That's not a point of order,
No,
Mr.
he
Speaker.
talked about.
That's not a point of order.
As if it's just them.
Hang on, Mr.
Talking
DeSilva.
about the bank.
Okay, that's not a point of order, Mr. Cannoneer, but I thank you for your contribution.
Okay,
Continue,
now,
Mr. DeSilva.
My apologies.
now, Mr. Speaker, and I want to emphasize, right? Let me, it's obvious that the consultants for the OBA have given them their script because they're all on it. They're all on it. And you see it on the blogs, and you see it tonight. Just look at the topics. They've been given their orders. Let me just finish on this, Mr. Speaker, again one more time, right? You have a leader in Premier Butt. They have tried to insinuate that our premier is doing something underhanded with Restcrest. Mr. Speaker, there are ways and means to check, see who earns what shares and what company in this country.
20 seconds, Mr. DeSilva.
You have a register of interest. All I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, is stop getting that kind of personal where you may force or coerce the police into investigating members of parliament and then, therefore, paralyzing them.
Thank you, Mr. DeSilva. Any further speakers?